So last Tuesday night, I had the privilege of hearing Ambassador Andrew Young speak at a community-wide event that was hosted over at Temple Israel. Andrew Young, you may know, is a civil rights leader who marched with Dr. King. He was also a U.S. congressman, ambassador to the United Nations under President Jimmy Carter, mayor of Atlanta, and an ordained minister in our own denomination, the United Church of Christ. And it was Ambassador Young's faith that was most on display as he spoke on Tuesday night to a crowd of close to 400. Over and over again, he invoked the stories of the First Testament to describe his experiences as a young activist fighting for the rights of Black and brown folks and for the soul of our whole nation. We always thought we could do the impossible, he said. We believed the stories of the Bible. He described a day when he walked through a crowd of Klansmen during a protest. He'd taken the risk because, he said, I saw them as my poor white brothers. They were angry at our progress. They still are. Those folks, they fell on Andy Young and started to beat him until someone, a large Greek man, stepped in and said, come on, let him through. And the crowd parted. Said Reverend Young about that moment, it may have been the KKK, but it was as good as the Red Sea to me. Friends, this is what I mean when I say that we have inherited a rich collection of stories. I mean that these ancient texts have the capacity to fortify us, to guide and compel us when we need it most. Believing in them, the way the Reverend Young and the other civil rights leaders believed in them, has less to do with whether these events literally happened, and much more to do with the power they have to transform lives. Take the story of David. He was a kid when he was called in from the wilds where he'd been tending those family sheep. The youngest, with 7 brothers, all older, stronger, and more strapping than he, David didn't appear to be a likely candidate for king. And yet God chose him, instructed the prophet Samuel to anoint him. That story is proof positive that you never can tell who might be called to lead, or how saying yes may change us. Knowing what you're doing doesn't appear to be a divine prerequisite. Not if you ask Ambassador Young, and not if you ask David. Both of them were youthful and entirely inexperienced when they were called into leadership. What mattered more was their willingness to say yes, their courage, and their trust in God. And the thing that strikes me in particular about Ambassador Young's story is that his courage, it was fortified by this large dose of empathy. The refusal to see the men who attacked him as enemies. His choice to see them as siblings. And that empathy, it was rooted in the conviction that God created all of us, is determined to reconcile us, and has the power to do so. In the words of Andrew Young's memoir, ours is a God who can make a way out of no way. Many of the heroes and heroines of the First Testament have this in common. They trust God in the face of unlikely odds. Or, in some cases, they don't trust, and God surprises them by showing up anyway, as with the story of Sarah and Abraham, who had a baby when Sarah was 100 years old. David was the unexpected king who relied on God. From the day he took down that well-armed giant with just a stone and a slingshot, to the day he said yes to all those elders and took the throne. Now, to be fair, There were also days when David got too full of himself, used his position for personal gain, and hurt those around him as a result, which makes David's story not only a source of inspiration, but also a cautionary tale about what happens when we confuse our power with God's power. In the end, despite his flaws, David went down in history as a beloved king, the one who ushered in peace and prosperity for all God's people. None of us knows for sure what impact we will make, it turns out. In the long run, we don't know which of our choices will tip the balance toward love and justice. It is up to us to wade in anyway, to risk saying yes when God comes calling, because God does extraordinary things with and through all kinds of people, even us. At our all-church retreat back on September 29th, the Reverend Susan Townsley referred to all of us gathered as leaders. Not everyone in the room that day holds an elected position here at Saugatuck Church, but everyone there, and many more who couldn't make it that Saturday, feel a sense of investment in the ministries of Saugatuck Church. By naming us all leaders, Susie invited us to lean into that sense of investment, to think about this church, God's church, not just in terms of our personal needs and perspectives, but in terms of the whole church and its God-anointed role in the world. She reminded us that we all have something to contribute to that. It strikes me that often, maybe more often than not, it takes someone else to recognize our gifts and to call us out into faithful action. The way those elders called out David and a youth minister called out Reverend Young. It's certainly been true for me, not only early on when I was first discerning a call to ministry, but all throughout my life, that I have benefited from people who have seen something in me, pointed it out, and nudged me in directions I would not have considered on my own. What if we all did more of that? What if we took our cue from the Israelite elders who anointed David and saw it as one of our roles as a community of faith to call out the gifts we observe in each other, to say, I see this in you, and then to anoint each other, not just to serve on committees, but to go out and use those gifts to serve God and God's people in the world, in offices and boardrooms, in classrooms and community centers. What if we made it part of our faithful practice as a congregation to cultivate that willingness, that courage, that trust in God, so that when we hear a call, we're ready to send someone or to go ourselves, to declare hope in a culture that is plagued by a deep cynicism, to offer connection in the face of chronic isolation, to dismantle systemic racism and end global poverty, to protect the health of our neighbors and of the earth itself. Beloved in Christ, oh, there is plenty to do. And yes, it may all sound daunting, even impossible as escaping from Pharaoh's armies, or unifying a chronically stiff-necked and divided people, or overturning Jim Crow. But friends, here's what those ancient stories remind us. The impossible becomes possible when we put God at the center. In that second passage that Michelle read this morning, David carries the Ark of God up to the new capital city of Jerusalem, the Ark which was thought to be God's home in their midst. Because David knew he couldn't do any of the work with which he had been charged apart from the very presence of God. And what did David do as he led that procession? As he marched out in front of the Ark of God, he danced. Danced with all those other leaders, danced with abandon, danced with all his might. Friends, that's the kind of leadership we are called to bring to everything we do together. Leadership infused with wonder and with joy and with celebration that God is in our very midst. And if the people ask you along the way, which God is this? What God inspires you to dance? Tell them this: the God of Exodus, who broke the chains of an oppressed people, led them out of slavery, and parted the waters to let them through. The God who forged those wandering Israelites into a community and led them through the wilderness and promised not to abandon them. It is the God who answered their call for leadership by sending not necessarily the leaders they expected, but the leaders that they needed. The God who inspired young King David to dance with all his might. That God, the God at the heart of our ancient texts, is the very same God who moves among us even now. It's the God of Moses, and of David and Michal, God of Ambassador Andrew Young, God of our brother and our guide, Jesus Christ, and our God who has not stopped breaking the chains or liberating lives, has never ceased longing to reconcile us one to another, still calls the most unexpected folks and anoints us to lead. I know this because I have read the stories, and I have heard them told, repeated one by one by one, and I have witnessed the courage that the stories inspire, then and now, right here in all of you. For that I say, thanks be to God. Amen.